Usually when you do talks like this, the first question that comes up is, what is an old book? And usually people mean by that, what's a valuable old book? Well, the first printed book was in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. If any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you it's valuable. Matter of fact, the last time one sold, half of it sold for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000 on average, and some even more. But anything printed in the 1400s is valuable. Some more than others, but anything in the 1400s. After that, it depends on what the book is. You could have a book printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and uninteresting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and uninteresting book now. Nobody cares or will pay anything much for it. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there are a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature, Dickens, Twain, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and the like. And even within that, there are a lot of things that can make a big difference in the price. You can have a book, and every book came out in a first edition. So when you're looking at it, it's what the book is, how important is it? And if it is an important book, a lot of times the condition can be very important. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes, absolutely mint condition, perfect, as if nobody had ever touched it. At the time he got it, he sold it within a week for $750. At the exact same time, another book dealer had the same book, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway. They had the Mosquitoes, no dust jacket, a little bit of Nixon bumps on it, and they sold it within a year. It took $50 because people who collect are looking for the best. They're looking for the most wonderful. They want to be able to say, I have the best copy, and they'll pay absolute top dollar for the very best. Another thing is, when you talk about first editions, like I said before, all first editions came out as every book as a first edition. Some never came out in a second edition. Probably most of them never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody wants or cares about them or would pay anything whatsoever. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, once again, if the author's unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed maybe doesn't add much value to it. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. It might mean an awful lot to your family, but it doesn't mean an awful lot to anybody else. And it has sentimental value, but not much more. On the other hand, a book signed by someone famous, maybe Ernest Hemingway, that can add hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to the value. In almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances that add or subtract to the value. And I use signed books to show that off. There are some signed authors who are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, for instance, who lived up in New Hampshire, he was reclusive. He didn't appear in public, and other than to a close personal friend, absolutely would not sign a book. Thus, his signature adds thousands of dollars to the value because you just can't get them. And here's actually, this is a little aside that I sometimes tell. People ask me, is there anything that you've sort of seen that you didn't get that you're hoping would show up? And there was one time, sort of the fish that got away. There was one time someone came in with a group of letters to J.D. Salinger, and they were nice letters, they were valuable, but there was one particular letter that I liked. J.D. Salinger was referring back to when he first moved to New Hampshire, and he was telling about when they were building his house, that there were a bunch of high school kids who helped build the house. And he sort of in an aside said, yeah, and one of those high school kids turned out to be quite a good athlete, that kid Carlton Fisk. So Carlton Fisk helped build J.D. Salinger's house. Maybe someday I'll hear about that letter, but I almost believe it should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Another author that maybe some of you know or have heard of wrote wonderful ghost, buried treasure, pirate stories of the New England coast. His name was Edward Rose Snow. Again, maybe some of you know or have his books. And Snow signed a lot of his books. One time he came into the store, and my father, he was a good friend of my father's, and I knew him, and he told us he'd just been on Cape Cod, and he'd gone to a bookstore that he had never been to before. Snow said he went right up to the section where his books were, pulled the copy off the shelf, opened it up, and exclaimed, "My, a rare, unsigned copy." And then he pulled out a pen, signed it, and then he introduced himself to the owner of the store. So books signed by Edward Rose Snow are not as valuable. My father once had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. It was the first edition, but it didn't have the paper dust jacket. It was well worn and read, sort of just opposite what I was saying before. But when you opened it up, it was inscribed to the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, in addition to that, when T.S. Eliot read the book, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, added things in, crossed things out on just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $100,000 to maybe even $300,000 because of the association. One last story about signed books. We had a copy, a friend of ours had a collection of it, Robert Frost. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Frost, but he also knew Frost. And when he was 13 years old, he went to London and he bought a copy of Frost's first book called The Boy's Will. Very complicated, what really is the first edition. Paid a lot of money for it at the time, came back to New England. A few weeks later, he met with Frost. He said, "Look what I've got." And he showed him the copy of the first book called The Boy's Will. Frost said, "What did you pay for it?" He told him, and Frost said, "Give me the book." Frost took the book, and in the front two end papers wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second binding, from the third binding, from the fourth, how they change bindings, why they change bindings, the different colors of the bindings, on and on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy and said, "Now it's worth what you paid for it." So you never know what's going to show up. And I'll give a little bit of my background and history. The history of the Brattle Book Shop goes back to the 1800s, but for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married, my mother had $500, and with that $500, they bought half interest in the bookstore. It's always been in Boston. People call us from Harvard Square all the time saying, "We're in Cambridge, where are you?" We tell them we're downtown. When my parents first bought the store, there was a little side street in what was Scully Square called Brattle Street. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't even exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. And we've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. And every time my father would move, he would move the best books to his new location. Then he'd run sales, and he was also a character and a showman. And the sales would go 50 half price dollar, 50-cent quarter dime. Last day of the sale, everything was free, and he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever. Ring the big bell. The people go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, they'd ring the bell again. That group would leave. The next group would come in. And he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969. We were moving from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall to West Street, where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. And like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. You can sort of picture this. He hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team, and they filled it up with books, and they drove it from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by Boston Common to where West Street is, back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, The superintendent in charge of traffic was a friend, told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour, the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He had gotten his point across, and we've been on West Street since then. And when we first moved here, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. In February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. The building was on fire and literally burned to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to keep going, not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. We rented folding tables. People either sold, gave us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And within a month, we got going. It was a meager start, but the main things just continued. Over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is, again, a few doors down on West Street. It's sort of the old Dickensian style of store. Outside stands at $1.03 and $5, 2 floors of general used books, then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, leather bindings, and so on. And that type of business, the large, old, general secondhand bookstore, is a dying business. And I hate to say this, with what's going on now, it might even be dying faster. We're going to be here. I've been doing this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I don't know. Maybe it was. They say so. And I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973, I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year now is, 45 years, almost 50 years, and I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. I have daughters who are in their early 30s. I don't think they have any interest in coming in the way I have, but it's a lot of fun. One of the things that people sometimes ask, and I'm going to hold a few things up to the screen, hopefully people can see it, but what's one thing that I wish I could find, and it's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian. It doesn't look like very much, but the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's his first book. It's a classic rarity in American literature. Matter of fact, the first copy to ever really show up and be found was in the 1890s on a dealer's 10-cent table. Another dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out, and then in 1890, sold it for $1,000. Another copy showed up in the 1950s. There were 2 postmen in the New Bedford area who on the other side were book scouts. And being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were. They went to a yard sale, bought a trunk of books, bottom of the trunk is a Tamerlane. Families got involved, they got to negotiating. After 6 months, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again, but they got their $10,000. And then about 20 years ago, an antique dealer died in the Newburyport area. The whole estate was auctioned, painting, prints, furniture, antiques, books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each. Someone, of course, picked out a Tamerlane, and 20 years ago sold it for $198,000. And one sold a few years ago for $800,000. Let me just say, this one's a facsimile. A lot of what I show and bring are original, and I'll show some more, but I don't hang around and sort of just hold $1 million pamphlets like this. But if any of you ever want to get in touch, get a better picture, go home, check your attic cellars, basements, if you ever find one, please give me a call. I'd love to hear about it. Another item I have here, and it's a letter, but it's on White House stationery, and it's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, "Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's the most important post, et cetera, et cetera. It's signed, oh, it's hard to see with this, but it's signed always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt. And it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, on the surface, this seems like a great honor. It's an ambassadorial appointment. Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which of course he probably was. Curley's response to Roosevelt was, remember, this was 1933. He said, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. And he said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's thoughts of Washington didn't change over the years. In the shop, we also have 10 letters that he wrote to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly liked. He had just gotten into prison and he wrote to his wife and he said, many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington. In any case, enough of Curley. We also get a lot of things that pamphlets, brochures, magazines. Here's one. Whoops, it would help. It would help if I got it up right side up. But it's a program from the 1912 World Series. Now, needless to say, I'd like to see baseball get going again. But this is the original program. The Red Sox played the Giants. The Red Sox won the World Series in 1912, won a few more times in the teens. Then we had to wait a long, long time. I hope we don't have to wait that long again. And not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back, there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are $2 for a quarter, shirts are $1.50 and $2. I don't know that you'll get them for that nowadays. It's also become very popular to go on cruises and cruise ships. And I have a brochure here for a ship, tells you a wonderfully built, where to book passage. And anyone who wants to go on the Titanic, this is an original brochure. And almost anything that you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. And one thing I always try to emphasize when I talk to people, when you're watching Antiques Roadshow or watching things about antiques, it seems like everything all of a sudden is worth hundreds, thousands, millions of dollars. And I like to point out, not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And the large majority of these sell for a few dollars. I mean, they're not very expensive. There were loads of them. There were a few exceptions, but they were a lot of fun. We used to have a wall at the store by a stairway where we'd have a few hundred of the more famous lives hanging. People would stop and stare at that wall, sometimes for half an hour at a time, just lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the stories, the articles, the photographs, made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell on the right date. As a matter of fact, we had one regular customer come in one time. He bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II. And I said to him, why are you buying these? It wasn't what he normally bought. And he said, well, I want to teach my children about World War II. And he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the old Lives, read a couple of the articles, look at a couple of the photos, and then discuss it with his children. Sounded like a good idea to me. I was a little skeptical. He came in a few weeks later and I said to him, how's it going with the Lives? He said, fabulously, but not the way I thought. He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they did everything else. I have other things here. It's a little hard to see. I have a cookbook from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. Then you have How to Bake Eels the Common Way. I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but that's beside the point. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses in the States. That's how we get most of our books. And even with what's going on, I was at an estate this morning. You have to be careful. You wear gloves, you wear a mask, you keep distance. We even had one lady who, when it first opened up, drew a map of her house, where all the bookshelves were, emailed it to us. When we got there, she was in her car in the driveway, had unlocked the door, had us go in, follow the map. Then we, on our cell phone, called her in her car. She said, told her what we'd pay. She said, that's fine. We moved all the books out, got out of the house, and then she went in, sprayed everything down, and you know, it's strange times, to say the least. In any case, I'll tell a few of those stories, and then I'll open things up to some of the questions, and we'll see how we can get those done. A number of years ago, I was out of the store. I got back. There was a message that a Mrs. Fisher had called. I called her back, and she said, oh, yes, my father died in Providence. He has 500 art reference books. We're going to call in a number of dealers. Would you be interested? 500 art reference books sounds like quite a nice library. Providence is only an hour away. We go a lot further than that. So, you know, I was more than happy to go down. They lived in an old street called Benefit Street up near Brown University. I got to the house. It was a large old colonial house. Got led through the house, led through the courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Family founded Brown University, one of the wealthiest families in the country. And after about 8 months, I bought 80% of the books I wanted. She was happy, I was pleased. And she said, my mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction. But would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there? I mentioned this to my wife. Well, their house in Newport is one of the mansions on the ocean. So when I mentioned this to my wife, she decided she'd be more than happy to come with me on this. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those houses that was still being lived in by a family. And at one point, wandering from the attic to the basement, all on my own, without a tour guide saying, come here, go here, but just wandering. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now, when I come to groups like this, and we'll figure out today how to get all your appraisals done, but I do hundreds of free appraisals. Matter of fact, my goal is that whenever you think of an old book, you think of me and the Brattle Book Shop. I don't care if you think of 10 others, just as long as I'm one of the 10. And one of the ways I feel I can do that is by giving out as much free information as reasonable. There are times, though, when people need very formal written appraisals for insurance, tax, whatever, and then I discuss a fee. In any case, another mansion in Newport, not as big as the Browns. This is the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry. And what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. They're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. But they were the day-to-day accountants, and sometimes they would capture a ship, realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. I mean, in 1812, that was a huge amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg. And that was the last you heard of the captain. Now, when my father was still alive, and he died over 30 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but it sounded like it might be interesting. She lived in Sharon, so it wasn't very far. got to the house. It was a little ranch house. Paint was peeling. Weeds were growing. You sort of say, ah, gee, what's going to be here? She answered the door. She was quite elderly, but she had walked in and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. Um, and she got to talking. It turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution. And she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe, all the court intrigues, all the goings on, how T.E. Shaw used to stay at their house all the time, how she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got it into the house, on one of her walls, she had 10 watercolors. They were pastoral European scenes. When I first saw them, I thought they were nice. The more she talked, the more I looked at them, the nicer they thought they were. And I finally said to her, those watercolors, they're really good. And she said, and turned around and matter of factly said, oh yes, they were all Turners. So she had probably $1 million worth of painting. It was like, oh yes. So you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. And matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 20 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Isn't Tokyo a long way to go? And he said, well, when I used to work, it took me over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who can tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. He said he was obviously a much younger man at the time, really sort of interested to see what type of learning and insight he was going to get from this dinner and these two men. He said he got there a little bit early, sat down. About 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was quite elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, sat down opposite, and he said, first thing, Ford turned to Edison and yelled, my Tom, you look very good. And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, it's the Carter's little liver pills. This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. I can go on and on and on with these stories. I'll tell one more, and then we'll see about some of the questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store. People wanting to know, do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or what's the value? How much is it worth? And so on. And most of those questions, either I or the people I work with, we can answer right off the top of our heads. Sometimes it takes a little more research. Occasionally you really have to study, but that can be fun. But every once in a while you get a call that really stands out. And again, a while ago, I answered the phone, hello, Brattle Book Shop, can I help you? Later, lady, elderly, thick Irish brogue. And the first thing she says is, President Kennedy slept with me. Now you have to admit that gets your attention. She stopped, waited for it to sink in, and then she went on to explain that, that she had worked for the Kennedy family. She had been his nursemaid. When he was 3 and 4 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of letters from the president. Now, presidential letters are valuable, any type. Handwritten presidential letters are even rarer and harder to get. She wanted to get an offer. I was skeptical. I thought she'd be fun to meet, though. I went to her house. She was fabulous, great stories. The letters were tremendous. I gave her what I thought was a huge offer on them. Much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. They were a whole part of her life. I left a note behind. Maybe someday I'll hear about them. As far as I know, her family still has them. But probably where they belong. Like I say, I can go on and on and on telling stories. I see a few. I see a few questions here. Anyone who has appraisals, if this ends before we get to them all, you can call, email, send pictures, we'll FaceTime, whatever. The first question is from Deborah. We have 1930s Big Little books. Would they be worth having appraised? It's interesting. Big Little books are these children's books that came out in the 1930s. They came out for a long time. And you'll see like Tarzan, Mickey Mouse. They're sort of square little books, usually cheaply made with nice covers. Because they were for children, they got used a lot. And it's interesting. I bought a collection about 3 or 4 years ago of Big Little books. And I called a colleague of mine. I said to him, how are you doing with these? How are they working out? And he said, well, I just went to a book fair and there were 2 booths that had almost filled with Big Little books. And he said, both of the people who were in charge of those booths were over 80. And he said, they seem to be the only ones that are interested nowadays. So Big Little books in really good shape. Most of them sell in the $5 to $10 range. There are a few, like I say, a few of the Mickey Mouse ones, a few maybe Tarzan, or even Tarzan's falling out because of demographics. But they do, but the large majority, $5 to $10, few exceptions. And then if there's any type of defect, because don't forget, children read them. And the books that are hardest to get in good condition are children's books and cookbooks. Obviously, the way cookbooks are used, many times you can tell by splatter marks the good recipes, but they get used, and children's books get used by children. So that answers that. Next question we have here is, with the fire, were the rare books insured? No. And actually, I can relate it a little to what's going on now, but the store was a 150-year-old building. It was absolutely crammed full. We never know how the fire started. There was some work, it could have been electrical, nobody ever found out, but we had almost no insurance. In the 1980s or the late 70s, the downtown area of Boston with the combat zone was really a rundown area, and it was almost impossible to get insurance at any type of reasonable price. And one piece of advice I'll give to people, if you own your own houses, have a demolition rider if you need it. Because what we didn't realize on our insurance policy, which was very small, is that morning when the fire chief came to me and he said, are you going to get your demolition company or ours to remove the rubble? It's dangerous. Well, let's put it this way. The demolition cost way more than our insurance. So basically the books were totally and completely uninsured. We had nothing left. Like I say, through the help of the city, the mayor, we found a location just a few doors up. People sold, gave us, donated. People volunteered helping us move things. It took us 4 years to rebuild the stock. And the real key to it was 4 years after that, the building that was next to our empty lot came up for sale. At that time, property was not cheap, but reasonable compared to now. And we got to buy the building. And if any of you know our store, our outside tables where we have the big open lot, that's actually where the store burned down. And you can actually, on the building next to us, you can see the outline of the building. And one of the things that I say about this building, it was built in 1930, it's steel and concrete, it has every alarm you can imagine, it has sprinklers, but also I can tell people with full confidence, you can burn a building down next to it and it won't burn. We've done it. And the other thing about it is that sort of really come in over the years that really is helping us now is, first of all, we own the property. If we didn't own this property, forget the pandemic, forget everything else, we probably couldn't afford the rent. But because of that fire 40 years ago, we have always planned financially that there is going to be a disaster every year. We just assume something that we can't foresee is going to happen, and we need a cash and financial reserve for that. We never expected to have a reserve that would cover this, and it isn't, but it's helping. And like I say, hopefully we'll be able to do this. My business goal for this year is to not lose too much money. But, you know, people are being helpful. They're calling us. We're going out. We're getting good things in. And I still love it. It's fun. Here's a little bit longer one. I used to go to a lot of book signings and would have the authors sign and personalize their book to me. Somewhere along the line, it occurred to me that it was probably best just to have them sign the book without the personalization, as I am not famous. Well, maybe you will be. So is it better from a monetary standpoint to just have a signed book rather than a personalized one? Thanks. Miss visiting the store. Well, we're open. When you feel comfortable, come in. That's actually a question that comes up an awful lot. You know, if you're getting a book signed, personalized, should you have the name put on it, your name, or whatever? And the way I look at it, a lot of that comes from sports collecting. In sports collecting, baseball cards, that type of thing, the collectors seem to definitely like it just signed. You know, they don't want it to Ken or to Wilma or whatever signed, because if you're not Ken or Wilma, then it's not to you. My feeling is, though, when you go to these book signings, 99% of the books are not going to be valuable, whether they're signed or not, because by the time these authors are doing large signings, they're fairly well known. The editions are fairly large. Also, I feel that with an author, they write for a living. The reason you like them is they write. The more they can write, the better. In other words, get them to add a date, a place, a time. That's good. Have it personalized to you, because get it done the way you like. Because like I say, most of those books are not going to be valuable. But if you've got a bookshelf of books that you've got signed, you want to be able to look at it maybe 5, 10, 20 years from now and look at that book on the shelf and pull it off and go, oh yeah, I remember when I went to this and someone signed it, someone else signed it, and it brings back the memories. So I say get them to write as much as you possibly can. In the example where I talked about the Great Gatsby before, where he signed it to T.S. Eliot, obviously one famous person to another makes a difference. But if you get Robert Frost, many times when he signs his books, he'll just sign it. Sometimes he'll sign it with a place, that's better. Sometimes he'll write a stanza of a poem. Sometimes he'll write out a whole poem. Well, in that case, the more the better, and so on. So generally, do it the way you like it, enjoy it in the way you're best going to remember it. I think that's the best way to do it. Well, I'll tell you what then. Why don't Deborah, we have the Student's History of the United States, Discovery of American Continent to the Present, Volume 1 and 2, published in Boston, but no print date. What are these? Any value? Well, that I can't answer you without seeing it. Part of the problem is the Student's History of the United States is such a common type of title that I can't say. Now, a couple of things that I will say is generally textbooks to that type are not of value. They have to get back to almost the 1700s before that type of book would be of value. Also, another thing to look for beyond sort of the age or that early in a career is when you're looking at an old book, the less the book is about, usually the better the book is. In other words, if you have a 2-volume book, a few hundred pages that covers all of discovery, the American continent to the present time, I will bet you it's not an in-depth scholarly study. As opposed to, let's say you have a 200-page book on the history of Framingham or something like that. Someone probably spent a lot of time, effort, and research looking for that type of thing. So there's probably a lot of valuable content in it. So that would be my initial reaction. If it's a textbook from the 1800s, mid-1800s up, probably not of value. But there are exceptions to everything. And like I say, I'll keep going with the exceptions. a lady one time brought us in a Spanish textbook from it was the early part of the 20th century. And you look at it initially and you go, these aren't worth anything. And then you look in it, and the student who had this textbook, it was from West Point, had doodled in it, all the way through, doodled in it. Matter of fact, you could tell where the student, where he had been more bored than other times. Is there a lot more doodles? And you go through it, it was almost every other page, you could tell a bored student. Well, when you look really closely, that student was Dwight Eisenhower. So you have a textbook from West Point that was Dwight Eisenhower's. Yes, that was valuable. Take Dwight Eisenhower out of the picture, you couldn't give the book away. Chip Hilton books. Chip Hilton was a children's series, sort of much like the Hardy Boys, Tom Swift, and so on. And they're sporting series, and they were going for good amounts of money, and they still do somewhat online. One of the things that's really changed the book business is, and I'll sort of go back 20 years for this, before the internet, books like that were really hard to get. I mean, you could look for them, and the only way, either traveling around the country or going to your bookstore every day, getting in Goodwood dealers, maybe getting lucky and finding it at a flea market, but you really had to hunt and search. And quite honestly, that hunt and search was probably a lot of the fun of collecting. Nowadays, though, you can go on and you go click, click, 50 copies show up, and they're much more available. A lot of them really weren't that rare. They were just hard to find. It was inefficient. Now the efficiency's up there, the copies, the prices have come down, but Chip Hilton still collected. If you have them absolutely mint, untouched, in the dust jacket, I mean, literally untouched, they start at about $10, and a few of the earlier ones can go up to 50 or 100. But anything less than that, and they're a great series that sell for $5 or $10. Let's see. Have an old gospel and sacred song used at the gospel meetings, 1875. They have any value? Generally not. Gospel, religious, Bibles, they're some of the most commonly printed books of all time. Always have been, always will be. And unless there's something particular about it, they probably aren't. I recently got an early 1800s edition of a gospel tune book from the Handel and Haydn Society. It was their first one. It wasn't in good shape. If that had been in good shape, well, that's a very important society. It would have been valuable. But the general ones that every church pew had on its back or people had at home, again, millions. I'd have to see it, but that would be my initial reaction. Maybe a year or so from now, or before that, I'll be able to actually come to the library. Although I enjoy doing these through FaceTime, and it's been fun doing it, getting the personal reaction, seeing people's faces, getting eye contact with everybody is fun. And looking and seeing the books, a lot of times when I do appraisals, I can do whole boxes at a time. We have a few questions about old Boy Scout books, handbooks mixed in, first edition in mixed conditions. If you have the actual very, very first edition of the Boy Scout handbook, first of all, that would be in England, or if you have the first American, they can run into the thousands of dollars. But it has to be not the first edition later printing. It has to be the very, very first one that came out. And it has to be in really good shape. And again, Boy Scout handbook is hard to get in good shape, because if you think about how Boy Scout handbooks are used, they have, it's hard to get in good shape. And, there are so many things like this that are fun, that you don't think of. You have to wear masks, or others that have done it in murals or things. In many ways, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, those might show more about what people's day-to-day lives were than the ones who write the historians. Why don't I say thank you very much. I know that I absolutely, though, want to assure everybody, normally I would stay until every appraisal was done, see everything. This format makes it a little harder, but if you have any questions, call. One of the biggest problems when you ask or email somebody a question who loves what they're doing, it's not getting an answer. It's getting them to stop answering. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. And you've given me practice for the next one too. Thank you.